Hare Hare. So today we are on, or this week rather. Oh yes, my apologies. We missed 1 week. I'm dealing with some, aren't we all dealing with issues of life? So the verse we're working on today, or this week, is chapter 2, text 11, which is quite apropos, at least for me. Before we go to 2, text 11, I want to read something that's going to set up the teachings that Krishna is providing in text 11 of chapter 2. We're going to go to chapter 1, and this is Arjuna speaking. He says, O Govinda, of what avail to us our kingdom, happiness, or even life itself, when all those for whom we may desire them are now arrayed on this battlefield? O Madhusudana, and this is what we're getting at. When teachers, fathers, sons, grandfathers, maternal uncles, fathers-in-law, grandsons, brothers-in-law, and other relatives are ready to give up their lives and properties and are standing before me, why should I kill them, even though they might otherwise kill me? I am not prepared to fight with them, even in exchange for the 3 worlds, let alone this earth. What pleasure will we derive from killing the sons of Dhritarashtra? So we go from there. That's Arjuna's question. We go from there and we jump to, this is Krishna's first statement. Krishna hasn't said anything in the Bhagavad Gita to this point. He says something briefly before, but he doesn't begin instructing Arjuna on anything until this point. This is the first instruction of Krishna to Arjuna. Text 11, Krishna says, while speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor for the dead. When we hear these two, we hear the question that Arjuna puts to Krishna, and we hear Krishna's response. Arjuna is asking, I'm standing here with the task of killing or causing to be killed my family. Krishna's response is, it's not worthy of grief. It makes you wonder, has Krishna lost the plot? How can you say that the fact that Arjuna's fathers, grandfathers, sons, grandsons are all going to be slaughtered on the battlefield, and Krishna has the audacity to say it's not worthy of grief? I had the, say both the blessing and the misfortune. The blessing to be with a friend when his mother passed away, and I was able to help him. This was in Mayapur in India. He brought his mom there to pass away. And we went to Gurukul together in the United States and in India. And so I was really blessed. I was blessed to be with him during that time. I was young, early 20s at best. And his mother passed away, and we all had a procession to the Ganga, to the burning ghat for her cremation. And there were some persons, senior devotees there, senior preachers, and they were saying something about death and so on and so forth. And they began quoting and teaching from this portion of the Bhagavad Gita, which is common. You hear that all the time. You know, the body's temporary, the soul is eternal, yada, yada, yada. And I remember standing next to my friend, looking at him, hearing this, looking at him, and I'm thinking, similarly, dude, have you completely lost the plot? This is not, or that was not the only time I've heard, witness to people using this section of the Bhagavad Gita and completely distorting, in my opinion, the true import and significance of this portion of the Bhagavad Gita. We pull it out when people are grieving for loved ones. This is not, persons who do this have lost the plot. When we do it for ourselves, when we're going through a period of grieving, and we open up the Bhagavad Gita and try to take solace from this area of the Bhagavad Gita, the soul is eternal, the body is temporary, we also are reaching for the wrong things at the wrong time, the wrong teachings at the wrong time. Which is why I'm titling this presentation, How to Grieve or to Help Others Grieve. This subject matter is not something we're going to cover in the 10-20 minutes of this presentation. This is an existential issue of the human being, dealing with loss and grief. I remember when I was very, very young, I had gotten 4 quarters, $1 essentially, from I think my grandmother or aunt. And I had these 4 quarters and I was going with some cousins who were going to go to the store, and I had never had 4 quarters before, so this was a big deal for me. And something happened, childhood, and I got upset, and in a temper tantrum, I threw the quarters on the ground, and the quarters flew in different directions. I was only able to retrieve like 1 or 2 of them. And I was completely distraught, having lost 2 or 3 of my quarters. And that grief was real. Now imagine if someone had come to me, and that's literally what happened. My cousins some of them were trying to make me feel good. Some of them were trying to say whatever they were saying. And of course, we don't. You're a child. You don't understand. You were completely consumed. I was completely consumed by the grief of having lost those quarters. Krishna is not, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Krishna, and it's very important, the most important word in this verse is ashochan. Ashochan means unworthy. Krishna is not saying no grief. Krishna is saying you are mourning, you are grieving for something which is not worthy of grief. And that is a key point. Krishna is not talking about grief. We know, those of us who study Bhakti Yoga, we know that love, bhakti, the Leela of Radha and Krishna, is full of overwhelming joy and grief, separation from Krishna. So Krishna is not saying no grief and to become a stoic. Krishna is saying you're mourning for what is not worthy of grief. And it's interesting how when we hear, or we're reminded of Arjuna's statement in chapter 1, fathers, grandsons, grandfathers, these people are going to die. And Krishna says yes, and their death is not worthy of grief. So the question is, what if the death of our children is not worthy of grief? And that's where we get it wrong. Our children die, our parents die, our friends and family die, and then someone comes and says, Mahavishnu, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Please leave me alone. This is not the time for that. At that situation, the best thing you can do is a hug and a gallon of ice cream. We lost the plot if that's how we're using this segment of the Bhagavad Gita. The question is, what's worthy of grief? And we understand what's worthy of grief by looking at it in this way. When I look at what had happened with my 4 quarters, I look at it now, I'm telling it to you, and you and I are having a wonderful laugh about it. What's changed? Why is it that now I can laugh, but at the time it was the end of my world? What's changed? Well, a number of things. Time, maturity on my part, distance, time and maturity has changed, so I can look on the same event and see that it is not worthy of lamentation. So when Krishna says, Arjuna, you are mourning for what is not worthy of lamentation. He's talking about you're having the wrong perspective. And it is an affliction which we all have and which Arjuna has. It's an affliction of myopia. We are myopic. We can only see this narrow band, our focus is so narrowed that we do not have the perspective to recognize that what we are grieving over is not worthy of grief. Now, again, I must reiterate, when we are afflicted by such myopia and we cannot see, our perspective is not broad enough to recognize it's not worthy of grief, don't come and read this verse to people. This segment of the Bhagavad Gita. We're dealing with loss. A hug and a gallon of ice cream. At that point, that's all that can be done. So the question is, how can we, in dealing with grief, how can we recognize what is worthy of grief and what is not worthy of grief? Because Krishna is not saying, don't grieve. Never said that. That's how we lose the plot. We think we're not supposed to grieve, and then we pull up the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita and we make everything worse. That's where we lose the plot. The question is not that we should not grieve. Read Krishna book. Grief is everywhere. Read the bhajans of Narottam Das Thakur. Grief all through them. The question is understanding, having the perspective to know what is and what is not asochan, what is not worthy of grief, and that requires perspective. It does not even require Bhakti Yoga or Vaishnavism. The verse, chapter 2:11, it's Nanu Sochanti Panditaha. It isn't Nanu Sochanti Vaishnavaha. Krishna is not saying that Vaishnavas see this way. Krishna does not talk about Bhakti Yoga and Vaishnavism for another 7 chapters. Krishna is saying Nanu Sochanti Pandita. A person who has 2 IQ points should be able to figure this out. Pandita, someone who is awake, aware, can understand what is and what is not worthy of grief. So it's not, I'll come back to that. So it is perspective by which we can understand what is or what is not worthy of grief. When we look back on an event and we think, you know what, yeah, that was rough. But we have maturity, we have perspective, and then we see what truly was worthy of grief and what was not. But being able to do that in the moment, that's the key. How to bring that perspective from distance, from time, from maturation, how to have that perspective and bring it to the moment of the event. That same perspective that generally comes with time and maturation, how can we have that in the event at the time of the event itself? That's the question. When I was living in Norway, that's appropriate, I was grieving. And to deal with my grief, to run away from my grief, I literally signed up for a marathon, the Oslo Marathon. And I mean, this was 20 years ago. At the time, I still play soccer, but at the time I was an avid soccer player. I was fit. I was in my late 20s. And I'm going to go and do this marathon. This was how I was dealing with my grief at the time. And essentially, I nearly died. I completed it, but I nearly died. Because the way to gain perspective and deal with grief is not it's like showing up, or like I did, showing up at a marathon and trying to run a marathon without having trained for it. It's like showing up for the Olympics and the day of and expecting you're going to win a gold medal, let alone even complete a race. But do you get my point? We have to practice, we have to deal with grief before the event takes place. Once we're in a situation of loss, once we're in a situation of pain and a distraught experience, whatever maturation we have at that point, that's it. That's what we're dealing with. That's how we have to muddle through our grieving. The way to deal with grief is beforehand, long beforehand. That's how we're going to take that or have that perspective available to us at the time of the event. That's how we're going to have that maturation, that distance, that time to have the proper perspective at that particular moment of the event. So it has to happen beforehand. And the question is, how do we do that? And Krishna, he talks about this. We're going to come up to this point in a couple of weeks. Sitoshna Sukha Dukkha Da. Winter and summer seasons, happiness and distress remain steady in happiness and distress. In other words, we prepare for grief by understanding and dealing with our happiness. That's the time to deal with grief. When we are joyful, when we are satisfied, content, happy, at those times, that's when we must sit back and observe. Sit back and live those experiences and recognize that these experiences are what they are. Live those experiences. Recognize the transigent nature of those experiences, happy experiences. Put them in the place and enjoy them for what they are. It doesn't mean negating. This is nothing about negating. But you will come to experience satisfaction and happiness in a very, very different way than being in a situation where you are overwhelmed or you are, what do they say? Time flies when you're having fun. It shouldn't. Time should not fly when you're having fun. Quite the opposite should be the case. When you're having fun, you should be fully immersed in it. What do they talk about? The eternal now. You should be so immersed in it that you're experiencing every moment of it. And in that experience, every moment of your satisfaction with a particular person or if it's a particular event, when you experience it fully, moment by moment, when the moment passes, you've already gained the maturity, the perspective to know the moment will pass. You have experienced happiness moment to moment. So when distress comes, when pain comes, when it's time for grieving, you will know, yes, I'm experiencing this grief now. It too will pass. You bring a perspective, that perspective of maturation, that perspective of distance, that perspective of time. You can bring it into the event because you've been living your entire life by experiencing each and every moment, every occasion, fully and completely. You don't need to be a Vaishnava to understand this. You don't need to be a Vaishnava to experience this. What is needed is taking the time, not at a moment of grieving. It's too late. You can't show up at a marathon and think you're going to run it. You're going to kill yourself. You have to practice beforehand. And the time to do that is right here, right now. Literally. When we finish this presentation, shut everything down and just look around you in the room you're sitting in and just experience everything around you. Experience your existence, how the things around you are here, they're pleasing, some things may not be pleasing. These things are temporary, they will come and go, and just experience that. But do that always. Develop the habit of doing that every single day. For those of us who are second initiated, before, after chanting our Gayatri is an excellent time to sit and just be for a moment. And just recognize that if you're in a good mood, in a good place, experience it. If you're in a bad place, experience it. Because that ability to do so is what's going to enable us to have the ability to recognize what is worthy of grief and what is not worthy of grief when we are in a specific situation. We have to practice this beforehand. We've got to practice this. We have to have the ability. We have to bring maturity to events and moments that are typically would cause grief, as Arjuna is talking about. So we're not talking about negating grief. That's not what Krishna is saying. Krishna is saying, understand what's worthy of grief and what is not. And this is critically important, because oftentimes we think that, oh, if I don't grieve, that means I'm hard-hearted, complete hogwash. It is just the opposite. When we know what is worthy of grief, guess what? We also know what is worthy of love. That's how this works. That's what Krishna is talking about. If Arjuna doesn't know, if we do not know what is worthy of grief, we're going to miss the boat of love. When there are opportunities of love, we are not going to know whether or not it's worthy of love, for using the term. We won't understand. We won't recognize love when it's right in front of us, if we are unable to recognize when something is worthy of grief and when it is not. That is why it is absolutely critical to understand what is or is not worthy of grief. We gain that understanding by, in times when we are not grieving, by practicing and being aware of our present reality, fully dealing with friends, family members, adversaries. Be fully present in dealing with that, being present in that moment. With that comes the ability to, your perception changes. You're no longer afflicted by myopia. You have a full and complete picture, as much as is possible, of the reality you're dealing with, while you're in a state of satisfaction, happiness, and joy. You see all of it. It's kind of like, a nice example is listening to an opera. You can listen to it in such a way where you hear all of the instruments, all of the sounds, all of the vocalizations, or you can focus in on one single specific instrument while all the other instruments are playing. We want to have the perspective of understanding and seeing all of the instruments in their entirety. This is spiritual realization. Understanding and seeing the entire reality. Not being afflicted by myopia. Not to have that kind of vision that we can only see the four quarters and nothing else. And if we lose 2 or 3 of that quarters, our life falls apart. But remember, the practice has to happen long before the event or the issue takes place. We have to practice this in time. We have to live it, not practice. I don't like that word practice in this regard. We have to live it daily. And that's the thing. We go through life literally with life acting upon us. It's like we're in a dream. We literally live as if we are in a dream. It's acting upon us, and we're just sitting there for the ride. And in some ways, yes, that is correct. But really, the way to actually, what Krishna is talking about here, understanding, because Krishna is going to talk about perception in 3 verses from now, sense perception. What we must do is use our faculty to be aware of total reality. Be aware of more than just a myopic view of our attachments. Then, when genuine issues of grief arise, we will grieve. But we will grieve over that which is worthy. And Krishna doesn't say what's worthy of grief. You will notice that Krishna does not say what is worthy of grief. He simply says you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. What's worthy of grief, one can say bhakti, yes, connection with Krishna, those things are worthy. Separation from Krishna, that's worthy of grief, sure. But Krishna does not say this is worthy of grief and that is not worthy of grief. That is something that the individual, Pandita in this case, or Vaishnava, for those of us who are Vaishnavas, we have to come to experience that understanding. But we cannot do that if we're just going through life as if we're in a dream. Stop, shut things down for a moment before or after your japa, before or after your Gayatri mantra, and for just a moment, broaden. And it's not some kind of hocus pocus, new age, turn of phrase, broaden your awareness. It's not that difficult. You can do it within moments. Maintaining it is the issue. But to sit for a moment and just look around you and experience the transigent nature of the reality forces you, absolutely forces you to then reach for something that isn't intransigent, something that is eternal. And you begin to think along those lines. And the more we do it, the first day may be a few minutes, but the more we do it, the more we are able to live in a space where we're recognizing what is transigent and what isn't. That's how we deal with grief. Once we know what is worthy of grief, we grieve, and we grieve in full. We grieve with all our heart. But then we're also able to recognize love. And we love in full. We love with all our heart because we've recognized the real deal. That's enough for one weekend. Hari Hari.